I don't want to die, but I don't see any way out of this car trunk currently, and water's beginning to seep in. It was the little guy with the froggy eyes. He was where it all went wrong, though it hadn't started out so good in the first place. To start with, Jeb and I had driven out to this little hotel in the middle of the Badlands to conduct a cocaine deal which we were not financially nor intellectually equipped to be conducting. Jeb had conned his way into the purchase of a large quantity of cocaine, setting up the buy through some friends of his old Uncle Larry, who used to be something of a biker, until old Uncle Larry sold off his prized hog to pay for his meth habit. These guys we were meeting, I thought they were supposed to be Mexican or maybe Cuban, but I found out later that they were Polynesian. I hope that doesn't sound racist. I honestly didn't care. It was just a business deal. Or rather, a stick-up venture masquerading as a business deal. They thought we were so soft and easy they didn't even bring backup. Just one guy to make the deal and his two buddies. The two buddies, they were big hulking brutes of dudes. But even big hulking brutes of dudes lay down dead on the floor when you shoot them in the face. And shooting two guys in the face is relatively easy in comparison to shooting, say, 5 or 6 or 7 guys in the face in the same amount of time. So Jeb shot the two guys, and I told the third guy, their boss, our contact, that there was no money and there was no deal. We were just going to rip them off and disappear, and if he was smart, that would be the end of it. The contact agreed that sounded like a pretty good idea, so we took his gun and tied him up with sheets and towels and left him in the bathtub, though I realized only as we were leaving that Jeb had left him tied a little too tight around the throat, and the man was sure to asphyxiate within a few minutes. But I couldn't turn back. To test their supply, Jeb had gotten himself loaded up on a distressingly pure cut of the cocaine we were stealing, and now he kept looking at his gun as though he'd suddenly realized it was an answer to a whole host of questions he'd never even thought to ask. All we had to do was make it across the parking lot, from the hotel room we'd rented to do the deal to where our car was waiting, as we'd misunderstood the placement of the room previous to parking. It was while crossing the gravel lot that I spied the frog-eyed man I'd noticed when we'd first arrived, leaning in his doorway, watching the world go by. Some sort of salesman, I assumed, standing there in his mussy suit and overcoat, like a strange new breed of ice cream that didn't feel the heat of the desert that was somehow equally oppressive during both day and night. Now, it was night. The deep middle of the night, sometime after 3 a.m., a crescent moon high and yellow in the sky, and this frog-eyed guy was approaching us with a big smile on his face and what revealed itself to be a sawed-off shotgun up the sleeve of his overcoat. The shotgun went off and half of Jeb's face dissolved into grayish-red sand. But somehow the vicinity of the shot was just enough to blast the skin off his face, but still leave him standing and capable of shooting back. And that's what he did, emptying the remainder of his weapon into the frog-eyed man. I wanted to run. I wanted to cry. I couldn't think or hear anything. I hadn't been touched by the shotgun blast, but I'd been deafened and disoriented by it. I had no idea which way was up or what I was doing, except that I knew I had to keep following the bloodied skull in a suit that was lurching towards my car. Jeb was saying something to me, but I couldn't understand him. Half his mouth was missing. Most of his lips were back behind us on the ground in loose gelatinous fragments. When he yelled, the bloodied nub of his tongue would flap loosely out of the side of his mouth, and I didn't want to stare at it, but I couldn't look away. He put the back of his hand to his forehead like he was dealing with a sweaty brow, wiping away blood and muscle to reveal the white of his naked skull. Then we got in the car. Jeb was driving. I didn't even question it, though he was missing an eye and all the stuff that should have been surrounding the eye. Jeb was saying something. It sounded important, but it also sounded like wet cheese slushing out of an oil drum. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what would help. We hit the road, and Jeb seemed almost to be enjoying himself. He was half dead and ripped hard on uncut cocaine, screaming and laughing like a demon out of hell, or one of those cartoon monsters you'd see in a Hot Rod magazine. 6 miles down the highway, shock wore off and Jeb dropped dead, and I regained my senses just in time to pull us out of the way of an oncoming freight hauler. The driver screamed something at me as I steered us out of his lane and into the ditch on the side of the road, the car eventually flipping itself over like a flailing turtle, and then a few more times. I think I was out for a couple of minutes. When I came to, I pulled myself from the wreckage and then went back for the suitcase of cocaine, which had survived at least as well as I had. Then, suitcase in hand, I headed into the Badlands proper, away from the highway and towards one of the back roads I knew to be off in the distance. I got picked up not long after by a school bus full of dangerous hippies. The bus had been painted up like a diuretic explosion of color, and the folks inside were just as bad. They were dirty and malnourished, and had that gleam in their eyes that people get when they're in a weirdo sex cult and doing a lot of cheap drugs. There was an uncomfortably amphibious cast to the face of their leader, a bug-eyed lump of a man by the name of Adam or Alpha or something stupid like that. The more he talked, the more his face made me think of the frog-eyed man we'd left for dead back in the parking lot. And before long, I was given reason to understand why. The eerie-eyed leader was the brother of the body we'd left in the parking lot. But they didn't know that I was one of the ones who'd left him, nor even that he was dead. It just came to pass that one of the girls mentioned that their leader's brother was lurking around a local roadside motel, eyeballing a couple of queer-looking city boys who might be conducting some sort of shifty deal. Now the sex cultists and their leader were seeking out the aforementioned deal with plans to rip it off and kill everybody involved, but they'd gotten lost along the way and couldn't figure out where they were now supposed to be, so they were just driving around chanting folk songs in an atonal frenzy that bordered on a manic zeal a bit too closely for my comfort. They didn't ask me who I was or what I was all about, so I just stayed quiet except to ask them gentle questions a cultist might be happy to answer, such as what makes them feel so groovy and how they found their ways to their higher calling. I rode with them for a couple of hours, hearing tales of magical marvels and miracles, the types often perceived by people who are tripping balls while out of their minds from starvation and exhaustion. But then the sun was coming up, and the blood in my hair and all over my suit was starting to become more apparent, and I could see in their eyes that as time wore on, the cultists were growing a real desire to learn the story behind it all. So, when the bus had began its descent of a nice-sized hill and gotten up to a good speed, I took out Jeb's empty gun and I used the butt of it to bash in the head of the driver. The violence was a real shock to my system, and it was only when I saw the blood on my hands and felt its warmth cooling against my skin that I realized that my suitcase must have been releasing a fine residue of cocaine dust all over itself, which I'd inadvertently gotten on my hands and then rubbed into my mouth and the pores of my skin. So, what I'm saying is I was probably pretty high. Of course, I wasn't accustomed to violence. I was just a video shop clerk from a long line of video shop clerks, just like my father and his father before him and his father before him. But like so many in our illustrious trade, I'd gotten entangled in the get-rich-quick scheme of one of my more criminally minded associates, and now I was dangerously caught up in a frenzy of drugs and violence, my pupils no doubt dilated like those of a hunting cat. The bus went sideways as it missed the sharp curve of the road at the bottom of the hill, and then it somehow tumbled end over end like a runaway fairground ride. The teacups were on the roller coaster and we were caught in a series of loop-de-loops. I saw a young man bounce sideways off a spiraling set of seats that had torn themselves loose from the floor. A girl took the business end of a dirty paintbrush through her eye. And I thought I might have seen a dog, somewhere in the chaos, yelping and running about madly for its life. The bus rose and fell like some great broken metal tide until it came to rest half in the stream of the Black Waters River, which twisted through the badlands like an angry snake. Once the bus had stopped moving, I reclaimed the suitcase and climbed my way past the broken and bleeding bodies of the sex cult, taking time to spit in the face of their leader, who was still quite alive, but pinned beneath an oversized beanbag chair and bleeding from the mouth and anus. The latter of which I only knew because of his quivering complaints, as those of his followers, still capable of ambulating, took after my example and departed the bus, leaving him and the others behind, as though they were just a bunch of creepy, soon-to-be-forgotten strangers. I did notice that the dog made it out okay. In the light of dawn, removed from the carnage of the accident, I could see that he was some sort of a massive pit bull with a weird underbite. He looked at me like I was the asshole, and then he set off towards the south. I envied his self-confidence and obvious survival skills. I followed the river north and made it about 3 miles before one of the sex cult girls caught up with me and broke both my stride and my spirit with a single well-placed stone, catching me square in the back of my head, sending me spiraling out across the ground in quite a lot of pain. Then she rolled me up in the trunk of a car she'd stolen from some smitten motorist, and presumably made off with both him and the cocaine I'd previously perceived to be my possession, but which I had now come to realize was really an object whose ownership was of a more transitive nature. Once the trunk came down, then everything was dark, but I could still feel the motion of the vehicle as it slipped off the road, taking me back down into the river. And now the water's coming in. The Black Waters River runs cold, despite the heat of the surrounding area. I wonder why that is. But I suppose it's not the sort of thing I can just go look up. Not at this point in my story. The water seeps into the car, into the trunk, and gradually starts to fill the space. It swallows me up. And yet, even as the darkness begins to overtake me, I have to wonder if there isn't some way for me to escape. Those are the moments when you pray for a miracle, something impossible. And sometimes you get one. Obviously, how else would you be hearing this story? Okay, the truth is, a passing cop saw the car and pulled me out of the water after I gave myself a concussion bashing the trunk open with the top of my skull. I gave him a fake name and a wild story about being hijacked by a drug-crazed survivor of a sex cult, and he gave me a dour expression and a ride back to the city limits. With still a few miles to go to reach home, and still leaking blood from at least 2 fairly nasty wounds in my head, the cop kicked me out of his car, leaving me to limp my way back to my apartment and my bed. All in all, not the best beginning to an illustrious criminal career. But everybody's got to start somewhere, right?